London. 1641. The summer of that year saw a truly remarkable, unprecedented moment in Britain that would change the course of history, not just in England, but the entire world. The Star Chamber. The Crown's censorship court gave King Charles I absolute control over all printing in England. But in July of that same year, to the King's outrage, Parliament abolished the Star Chamber, and overnight, censorship collapsed. This very moment was the birth of the British press, the prototype for everything from the Times to Twitter. Ink, once the Crown's instrument of silence, was about to become its undoing. By late autumn of that same year, 1641, on a crisp November morning, a pamphlet begins circulating among London's artisans and merchants, MPs and lawyers, in coffee houses and taverns, and even among magistrates and nobles. Inscribed on every copy was London, printed for JT, 1641. But who was JT? And why such a diverse readership? Well, this was no ordinary pamphlet. Its name? Heads of Severall Proceedings. Its purpose? Gossip. 17th century style. Initially circulated on the 29th of November, 1641, Heads, as it became colloquially known, had the very first scoops on shenanigans within Parliament, and it truly could not have come at a more turbulent time. The Crown and Parliament were in open conflict with one another, and this was a rupture without precedent in English history. For centuries, the monarch had ruled unchallenged, with Parliament serving merely as an administrative convenience, summoned when the Crown needed money, dismissed when it didn't need them at all. But over time, Parliament had grown in confidence, wealth, and influence. It now commanded not just with words, but Parliament had its own army, and with that, the balance of power shifted for the first time in living memory. The idea that the king might be answerable to anyone, let alone his subjects, was unthinkable to Charles. Yet, by 1641, that unthinkable moment had arrived. England was divided by a monarch clinging to divine right and a parliament daring to govern in its own name. Heads published direct quotes from Parliament, completely unheard of at the time, as parliamentary proceedings were secretive, which means, astonishingly, the editor had sources from within Parliament itself. This was the world's first leaked stories. And we can only imagine how exciting this must have been for the people around at the time to have had this exclusive gossip for the first time. But who was the editor? Well, the 17th century had no editors per se. However, remember how every copy had inscribed London, printed for JT, 1641. Well, JT stood for John Thomas, and he was the man behind the manuscript. We know surprisingly little about John Thomas, but here's what we do know. He was a London bookseller and stationer, working somewhere between the bustle of St. Paul's Churchyard and the smoky presses of Fleet Street. In 1641, as censorship collapses, he did something no one had dared do before. He gathered whispers from Parliament, arranged them into print, and sold them to the public. Ink-stained, hurried, and anonymous, John Thomas became England's, and indeed the world's first, accidental editor. The first man to turn the gossip into news. But what happened to JT? Well, he disappeared. A great mystery. Was he killed? Did he flee? We just don't know. However, what we do know is despite this pamphlet only circulating for a couple of months, it was to prove the blueprint for modern information sharing as we know it. Think of it as today's Substack, YouTube, or online independent journalist. By 1642, Charles was royally cheesed off with Parliament. They were not bending to his will. So he claimed the army as his own by raising the standard at Nottingham, effectively branding parliamentarians as traitors. This moment cannot be underestimated in British and indeed world history, because although the modern world in a technological sense developed in the soot and smoulder of the Industrial Revolution, from a political perspective, it developed right here. Parliament raised its own army, and the country fought itself. The king lost. Not just the war, but in 1649, he lost his head. Or rather, Parliament executed Charles I. And that is the moment the victors, the Institute of Parliament, of the people, for the people, superseded the crown. In fact, Britain was a republic, but only for a short while. And that's because the people never really held animosity towards the royals. And actually, they restored the monarchy in 1660. 11 years after his father's execution, Charles II rode into London to reclaim the throne, greeted by cheering crowds, exhausted by years of war and Puritan rule. The Republic was over, and England wanted its king back. But something fundamental had shifted. Once a monarch could lose his head, every ruler after them would have to keep theirs in check. And this certainly was not the end for the press. The cat was out of the bag. Many copycat publications sprouted, and although various censorship rules were brought in to try and curb them, they could do very little to stop the spread of information beyond what was state-sanctioned. However, despite this tussle between the monarchy and Parliament, the British people's liberty was still not sacrosanct, and the press was still just a collection of small pamphlets. Just around the corner, though, were two groundbreaking firsts. The Bill of Rights, 1689, gave Britain's world-class liberties, including freedom from arbitrary rule. Essentially, the Crown could no longer make rules on a whim. Everything had to go through Parliament. Freedom from cruel and excessive punishment, the right of subjects to bear arms. Freedom of speech in Parliament, the right to petition the Crown, and regular Parliament with fair elections. This laid the foundations for a high-trust, cooperative society, and made the British the freest humans that had ever existed on God's green earth. But there was still nothing legislated for the press. They were still shadow operatives. Until, of course, they weren't. In 1695, the Licensing Act collapses, and thus the free press is born. And so we have, for the first time, in all its glory, a parliament accountable to the electorate and the press. The printed word becomes Britain's bloodstream, every scandal and every headline. From the first daily paper, the Daily Concurrent in 1702, through The Spectator, The Times, and the Daily Mail, Britain built a press that not only informed, but defined its character. As the empire expanded on ideals of order and duty, the newspapers at home forged a culture of accountability. The Times driving the Reform Acts, the Pall Mall Gazette exposing social scandal, the Daily Mail bringing world events to the breakfast table. Each step tightened the bond between a literate public and its institutions. Parliament, the courts, the monarchy. No other nation developed such a high-trust relationship between power and scrutiny. That journey, from pamphlets to broadsheets to a society built on shared information, reached its zenith in 1922 with the founding of the BBC. The first institution created not to rule or for profit, but to inform, educate, and entertain. The BBC's first broadcast on the 14th of November 1922 was to a very tiny audience. At the time, only 35,000 licensed radios existed, but by 1929, by the standards of the day, it had gone viral. 2.2 million licensed radios tuned into the most trusted information source on the planet. It truly was the gold standard. Now, before we arrive at the current state of the ideologically captured BBC, we must first remind ourselves of the undeniable greatness of the BBC. It has become an easy target for ridicule, but it wasn't always this way. You do remember, don't you? Of course you do. But in case you've forgotten, let us be reminded of the greatest of greatest hits.
Welcome to Match of the Day.
What? No, you can't tell me what to do. You ain't my mother! Yes, I am!
So what news have you got then, James, this week?
Well, actually, I've got some news from Korea.
You can't tell, can you, that Top Gear's just been sold in Korea?
No.
Well, I don't think there's any evidence. I think we're smoothing this one out nicely.
It's not showing.
We don't smoke in here.
Well, I fucking do.
Walk up to the girls and ignore them, and they'll be really sad. And then we'll turn around and go, "Oh, hello, lady, and they'll be overjoyed."
I love my big blubbery baby so much, Ken.
Imagine a world where every word ever written, every picture ever painted, and every film ever shot could be viewed instantly in your home via an information superhighway, a high-capacity digital communications network. What that would mean is you could transform your home into a mammoth interactive entertainment centre, with the odd stock exchange and shopping centre thrown in. It sounds pretty grand, but it all comes down to computers communicating. And in fact, that's already happening on something called the internet.
It's easy to get carried away with the modern framing of the BBC, but it's an institution that has given so much. However, that was then, and this is now. And now it's riddled with absurdities, pseudoscience, inaccuracies, partisanship. But it's not just the BBC, is it? It's institutions of all kinds. Government, education, other media, even health. All these institutions are now compromised. They're ideologically captured. Viruses these days are not viruses of the body, says Elon Musk, but viruses of the mind. And he's right. By now, pointing out wokery has become itself trite. But Britain's loss in its institutions does not have to be terminal. Social media, YouTube, independent creators and journalists. This is itself a new print revolution. We are the pamphlets of today. Whether the current institutions are forced to course correct or whether new ones emerge, we at least have a mechanism for change. Like the monarchy 350 years ago with the Star Chamber, the government is using forms of censorship, especially with the Online Safety Act, presented predictably as a way of protecting the kids, to try and stop independent voices. But the British people 350 years ago found a way to share information when it was costly, not just in terms of how difficult it was to print and circulate information, but the risk to their lives. They found a way. And like our ancestors, we will find a way. Many are cheering the downfall of the BBC, but I truly would love nothing more than the restoration of the BBC. Comedy that's funny. Drama that's as entertaining as it is historically accurate. Documentaries that examine history as it was, not framed by a modern narrative or slant. And finally, news that informs by placing journalistic integrity, free from governmental influence, at the heart of its mission. Give me salacious gossip. Give me investigative work. Give me undercover stings. Give me exposés on government corruption. We started this, and we can continue it.